Welcome to Holy Bible Explained. This is going to be a little a look at Good Friday, on Good Friday, April 18th, 2025. Let's kind of get into it here. I'm going to be starting off in the book of Matthew once again. And I've looked through the four Gospels and their account of Good Friday. And we're pretty much going to go through Matthew in its entirety, which is chapter 27 in Matthew. And then for Luke, or Mark, Luke, and John, I just kind of noted down some highlights where it's either supplemental information or maybe a slight variation. And I'm just going to touch on those. We're not going to read through every single account again and have all that overlap. So anyways, Matthew, and it starts off at verse 1. Very early in the morning, the leading priests and the elders met again to lay plans for putting Jesus to death. Then they bound him, led him away, and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, realized that Jesus had been condemned to die, he was filled with remorse. So he took the 30 pieces of silver back to the leading priests and the elders. I have sinned, he declared, for I have betrayed an innocent man. What do we care, they retorted. That's your problem. Then Judas threw the silver coins down in the temple and went out and hanged himself. The leading priests picked up the coins. It wouldn't be right to put this money in the temple treasury, they said, since it was payment for murder. After some discussion, they finally decided to buy the potter's field, and they made it into a cemetery for foreigners. That is why the field is still called the Field of Blood. This fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah that says, "They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price at which he was valued by the people of Israel, and purchased the potter's field, as the Lord directed." Now we're on to verse 11 here. Now Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. "Are you the king of the Jews?" the governor asked him. Jesus replied, "You have said it." But when the leading priests and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent. "Don't you hear all these charges they are bringing against you?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. We're at verse 15. Now it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner to the crowd, anyone they wanted. This year, there was a notorious prisoner, a man named Barabbas, or Barabbas. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I'm going to go with Barabbas, or Barabbas. I'll make up my mind eventually. Verse 17. As the crowds gathered before Pilate's house that morning, he asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" He, Pilate, knew very well that the religious leaders had arrested Jesus out of envy. Verse 19. Just then, as Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him this message: "Leave that innocent man alone. I suffered through a terrible nightmare about him last night." Now, before I go into verse 20, I'm just going to say that I don't believe that part was mentioned in the other Gospels. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be put to death. So the governor asked again, "Which of these two do you want me to release to you?" The crowd shouted back, "Barabbas!" Pilate responded, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him!" Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." And all the people yelled back, "We will take responsibility for his death, we and our children." So Pilate released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. Some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters and called out the entire regiment. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Now, in some of the others, they say purple. Just pointing that out. Verse 29. They wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head, and they placed a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and grabbed the stick and struck him on the head with it. When they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him again. Then they led him away to be crucified. Okay, now, before I continue on, which will be at verse 32 when we come back, I just want to go back to the Old Testament for a moment, and I want to take a look at Psalm 22. Because this is written by David. I can't remember if he was actually the king when he wrote this or if he was still kind of running from Saul. But in any case, David is about, in rough numbers, about 1,000 years before Christ. So this is very interesting to read the things that are about to be. I'm going to read. Yeah, I think I'll go up to about verse 18. That should be enough to get us what we need here. So Psalm 22, starting in at verse 1. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night you hear my voice, but I find no relief. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Our ancestors trusted in you, and you rescued them. They cried out to you and were saved. They trusted in you and were never disgraced. But I am a worm and not a man. I am scorned and despised by all. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their heads, saying, "Is this the one who relies on the Lord? Then let the Lord save him. If the Lord loves him so much, let the Lord rescue him." Yet you brought me safely from my mother's womb and led me to trust you at my mother's breast. I was thrust into your arms at my birth. You have been my God from the moment I was born. Do not stray so far from me, for trouble is near and no one else can help me. My enemies surround me like a herd of bulls. Fierce bulls of Bashan have hemmed me in. Like lions, they open their jaws against me, roaring and tearing into their prey. My life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength has dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust and left me for dead. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. Just very interesting how so much of that is like a picture of what's happening to Jesus as he's going through this whole crucifixion process 1,000 years before it actually happened. And from David, you know, the the bloodline from which Jesus is descended. Pretty powerful. Back to Matthew, though, chapter 27, verse 32. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon who was from Cyrene, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. And they went out to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. The soldiers gave him wine mixed with bitter gall, but when he had tasted it, he refused to drink it. Now we're at verse 35. After they had nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. Then they sat around and kept guard as he hung there. A sign was fastened to the cross above Jesus' head, announcing the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Now, before I go to verse 39, this is one spot where I'm going to just skip over to Mark's account, and that's in chapter 15. And there's just a couple verses I want to hit because this is right when Jesus is getting nailed to the cross. Mark provides us with one little more piece of information that we don't get from Matthew. And now I'm going to start in at verse 24. Mark chapter 15, verse 24. Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes and threw dice to decide who would get each piece. Verse 25 tells us, it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign was fastened to the cross announcing the charge against him. It read, "King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. All right, now I'm going to go back to Matthew. I just wanted to get to that because Mark's gospel says that they put him on the cross at 9 a.m. So it's just good to have the timeline of things so that you know, to understand that he was on the cross for 6 hours suffering. So Matthew 27, verse 39. The people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. "Look at you now," they yelled at him. "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, if you are the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross." Kind of that same thing we saw in Psalms where they were mocking and saying, "You who rely on God, let God save you." So there's that parallel there. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out was when they are saying, "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days." That's not something Jesus said, but it is something that his accusers accused him of in his trials that led to him being crucified. Verse 41. The leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the elders also mocked Jesus. "He saved others," they scoffed, "but he can't save himself. So he is the King of Israel, is he? Let him come down from the cross right now, and we will believe in him. He trusted God, so let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" Even the revolutionaries who were crucified with him ridiculed him in the same way. Okay, now this might be a good point to go jump over. I might have these mixed up. It might be Mark 15 or I might have to jump up to Luke. But I just want to give a little bit of contrast on this account of the revolutionaries. Yep, okay, I don't need this. So it is in Luke. And it's going to be Luke 23. And I'm guessing it's this verse 27 through 43. Yep, okay, here we go. So I'm going to pick up here so that we're still kind of in the same time frame as where I'm at in Matthew. This does back us up just a little bit. Whereas in Matthew, it was verse 39, says the people passing by shouted abuse, etc. Okay, this is right after. So in Luke, we're picking up right after Simon of Cyrene is made to carry Jesus' cross. It's Luke chapter 23, verse 27. A large crowd trailed behind, including many grief-stricken women. And here's the extra part why I'm reading from this passage. Verse 28. But Jesus turned and said to them, Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming when they will say, Fortunate indeed are the women who are childless, the wombs that have not borne a child, and the breasts that have never nursed. People will beg the mountains, fall on us, and plead with the hills, bury us. For if these things are done when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? And this is interesting here, those things he's saying, because it's very reminiscent of some of the things he says in Matthew chapter 24 when he's talking to the disciples about the end times. And he talks about how woe unto them that are with child, and pray that you don't have to flee in winter or on the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 24. I would, if you get some time, I'm not going to do it here today. There will be time in the future where I'll get to that. But if you're interested, I would go check that out and just see how it compares. I need to finish that up with Luke. My bad, sorry. Back to Luke chapter 23. And I'm going to just finish out this little bit here in Luke because there's something about those two criminals that are crucified with him that I kind of want to get to before we finish up the crucifixion in Matthew's account. So I had just left off at verse 31 in Luke 23. I'm going to pick up here at verse 32. Two others, both criminals, were led out to be executed with him. When they came to a place called the Skull, which this is that Golgotha, they nailed him to the cross, and the criminals also were crucified, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. The crowd watched, and the leaders scoffed. He saved others, they said. Let him save himself if he is really God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers mocked him too by offering him a drink of sour wine. They called out to him, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. A sign was fastened to the cross above him with these words, This is the King of the Jews. Verse 39. One of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed, So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself, and us too while you're at it. But here's a twist. But the other criminal protested, Don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything wrong. He's speaking of Jesus. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. So that takes care of what I wanted to look at in Luke. And before I jump back to Matthew, I'm just going to make sure that I don't get out of alignment here with the things I wanted to look at with John. Because I wanted to hit something in John 18 and John 19. That's 19. All right, so yeah, we'll look at John last. I'll just keep that its own separate little commentary. So I'm going back to Matthew here. We're going to finish out Matthew. So we left off talking about the revolutionaries who were crucified alongside him. So I'm going to be picking up here at Matthew chapter 27, verse 45. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. So what we're going to see here is there's some very kind of supernatural things going on while Jesus is on the cross and dying. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice. And I think this is like in Hebrew, so I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly. But he calls out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so he could drink. But the rest said, Wait, let's see whether Elijah comes to save him. Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. That's verse 51. Still in verse 51, the earth shook, rocks split apart, and then at verse 52 it says, and tombs opened. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. Verse 53. They left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city of Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. Verse 54. And I'm going to be backing up here in a minute just to make a couple comments, but I'm just going to take this to the end here first. At verse 54, the Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened. They said, this man truly was the Son of God. And many women who had come from Galilee with Jesus to care for him were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Okay, so the biggest one I kind of want to look at is at the moment that he releases his spirit. Now I should back up. Okay, so even at noon, the fact that darkness falls across the whole land, that's odd. I mean, it was dark from noon until 3 o'clock, and I think in John's account we're going to see the same thing mentioned again. But that's just really strange. Although at the same time, you have to realize that back in these times, all through basically until about the time of the Apostle Paul, there was like these supernatural occurrences that would go on that were, I don't want to say common, but I mean, compared with what we have today, I would say they were more common. And so this whole thing about darkness falling across the whole land in the middle of the day for 3 hours, I think is like symbolic of God's judgment, because you gotta understand when Jesus was dying on the cross, taking on paying the ransom basically for all the souls of humanity, to pay the price for everyone's sins, everyone who ever had lived up till then and was alive at the time, and everyone who would live after and into today and even future from today. He was taking on all the sins of all the world, not for some people, for everybody. And so that's a lot of judgment that God had to pour out on him. And sometimes there's, in Scripture there are phenomenon that oftentimes are, I guess, symbolic of God's judgment. And one of them is this darkness, lack of light. The earthquakes would be another one. And now, the thing that I really wanted to talk about just for a moment, though, was this curtain being torn in the temple. So, what this is all about, and this would make more sense if we had started like at the beginning, which I'll get to that in a couple weeks or so. Well, I mean, not immediately, but I'll start the process in a couple weeks here. But this sanctuary in the temple is like, so when Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and he went up to Mount Sinai and he got the 10 Commandments and all this, what he also got was a bunch of instructions for like priests, and because Israel was supposed to be God's holy nation and a nation of priests, that was their original intended role. And so God had given these instructions to build this tabernacle, and the reason it was constructed the way it was so it could be picked up and moved. But essentially the temple was like a more of a permanent location, but the same thing as this tabernacle. It was the place to worship, the place for sacrifice to atone for sins, and there was a place in it wherein God would reside, and that was called the holiest of holies, or in this case they're referring to it as the sanctuary. But this holy of holies or sanctuary was divided by a curtain or a veil, and that was because only the high priest could go back there, and only one time a year. And so this curtain was to symbolize man's separation from God. And so it's symbolic, for one, that when Jesus dies, this curtain is torn in two. But what's interesting about it also is the fact that it was torn from the top to the bottom, because this thing was pretty tall, and so it's not like it wasn't done by a person, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't ripped from the bottom up, like a person couldn't have done it. It was torn from the top down, so it was a supernatural thing. Basically, God tore that curtain because that barrier was now broken. I mean, not really officially, I guess, until Paul hits the scene, but I mean, the stage was set. Jesus had paid the price. He had atoned for all our sins, and now we don't have that separation. All we have to do is believe in his death, burial, and resurrection, and we get to approach God boldly without that veil or the need for what's the word I'm looking for? We don't need that like intercession from a priest. We have a permanent advocate with God now in Jesus Christ because of what he did. So that's just really amazing and something to be quite thankful for. Okay, so I'm going to go to John just for a few verses in chapters 18 and 19. I was going to look at Daniel, but I don't think we needed to do that. I think I'll wait until we're hitting the actual full-time Bible study, because you know what the heck. This is the crucifixion. This is where Messiah is cut down, as the book says. So I'm just gonna go. It's just a few verses. Let's go to Daniel chapter 9. And this is like, this all ties into Revelation and end time prophecy and stuff. But there is a spot that is like directly related to the crucifixion. So let's just go ahead and take a look. And I'll briefly explain what I understand of this. So starting at chapter 9 of Daniel, verse 24, a period of 70 sets of 7 has been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone for their guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, before I get into verse 25, I'm going to just explain a couple things quickly. And then this is another one where the King James Bible uses slightly different terminology, but the same idea, it says the same thing, but with slightly different language. It calls it like 70 weeks, I think, or something. But the 70 sets of 7 is just, I don't know why it's phrased that way, but essentially what they're saying is 490 years. And so a period of 490 years has been decreed for Israel and Jerusalem to finish their rebellion. So basically it's like they need to be punished for some things that they rebelled against God. For one thing, they were supposed to like let their land rest every 7 years. There were all these things laid out back in like Leviticus and I think in Exodus too, if I'm not mistaken. But when all these rules were put together, the things they're supposed to do, they kind of just like ignored it and were like, well, whatever, our land is great and we're having all this prosperity and we're just going to keep living it up and enjoying it, and we're not going to let the land rest even though God said to do that. So they owe, like, and I think what they called it, I'm not going to guess. I'll wait until we get to that part of the study. But so they owe like 70 sets of 7. So they owe 490 years of basically of bad times, or judgment, I guess we could call it. So at verse 25, picking back up, and this is Gabriel giving the vision to Daniel the prophet. So that's who's speaking. It's Gabriel. Now listen and understand. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the Anointed One, comes. Okay, so here's what that is saying. 7 sets of 7, so that's 49 years, plus 62 sets of 7. Well, 62 times 7 is 434. So 49 plus 434 is 483, and if this is all going over your head, I apologize. When we study some prophecy and stuff in the future, I'll have some better visual aids and things that'll help me explain. But for now, this was all very impromptu, so you're just getting me in a chair, rattling this off the top of my head to the best of my ability. So anyway, so 483 years will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the Anointed One, comes. Okay. So that means that 483 years will go by. So I think it's Nehemiah and Ezra were given the okay from, I forget which king, but it was Babylon, and they were given the okay to go rebuild the temple, which had already been destroyed when Israel was taken over by Babylon and they all got dispersed. So from that date until the Anointed One, Christ, would be 483 years. Now, here's the thing. After this period of 62 sets of 7, the Anointed One will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. So that's Jesus being crucified. And then there's a comma, and then it says, and a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. So I'm pretty sure that that is when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And then that's the end of that sentence. And so this kind of splits this verse in half. And this is one of those weird things of Scripture where, like, even though it's still in the same verse, the next part hasn't happened yet. The end will come with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. Well, we're still waiting for that last 7 years to happen before this end can happen. So anyway, I know that was a little bit of a tangent, but because it talks about Messiah being killed, I just figured I'd throw it in there and maybe whet your appetites to come back for more when we get into the overall Bible study. So anyways, we're going to wrap it up here with a couple passages out of John. Gospel of John, chapter 18. And I'm going to look at verses 28 through 37. And this is just a little more detail on the trial process before Jesus is handed over to be crucified. Because there's a couple things that are introduced here that wasn't mentioned in Matthew or Mark or Luke. So, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. The reason they would be defiled is because Pilate was a Roman, aka a Gentile, and the Jews were not supposed to mingle and even visit the homes of Gentiles. It was forbidden. And they'd have to go through all these rituals then to cleanse themselves. And with Passover right on the horizon, it just wouldn't have been in their mind worth the trouble, I'm sure. Verse 29. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man?" "We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal," they retorted. "Then take him away and judge him by your own law," Pilate told them. "Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone," the Jewish leaders replied. This fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die. Verse 33. Then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked him. Jesus replied, "Is this your own question, or did others tell you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate retorted. "Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done?" At verse 36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world." Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus responded, "You say I am a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true." And then it goes into Pilate asking the crowd, "Do you want me to release Jesus or do you want me to release Barabbas?" And we've already covered how that goes down. So now we're going to finish up in John chapter 19, Again, starting at verse 28, this is John's account of Jesus dying on the cross. And there's the reason I'm going here is there's a couple things that were not mentioned in the other ones. So I'm just trying to give as complete a picture as possible, and ideally as concisely as opposed to yesterday. So anyways, John 19, verse 28. Jesus knew that his mission was now finished, and to fulfill Scripture, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar of sour wine was sitting there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a hyssop branch, and held it up to his lips. When Jesus had tasted it, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and released his spirit. It was the day of preparation, and the Jewish leaders didn't want the bodies hanging there the next day, which was the Sabbath, and a very special Sabbath because it was the Passover. So they asked Pilate to hasten their deaths by ordering that their legs be broken. Then their bodies could be taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the two men crucified with Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. This report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you also can believe. These things happened in fulfillment of the scriptures that say, "Not one of his bones will be broken," and "They will look on the one they pierced." And I think that my notes, my margin says that that's from the prophet Zechariah, chapter 12, verse 10. So just to close it up here, I'm going to take a look and just read that verse. Zechariah, that's, I think, the second to the last book in the Old Testament, right before Malachi, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. Then I will pour out a spirit of grace and prayer on the family of David and on the people of Jerusalem. They will look on me whom they have pierced and mourn for him as for an only son. They will grieve bitterly for him as for a firstborn son who has died. So that was the prophecy John spoke of. So anyways, that is the biblical account of Good Friday, Jesus' crucifixion. And tomorrow will be Holy Saturday, and I'll maybe have a little something for Holy Saturday, but the next more thorough look at Scripture will be for Easter Sunday, and we'll examine the four Gospels. I'll try and plan it a little better like this one, where I'm not reading all the same things over and over from different people. But thank you for tuning in. I hope you found this video informational, useful, maybe inspiring, and hope you have a blessed Easter. See you next time.